Hello and welcome to part 1 of Professor Jordan's Whys of History number 6, where it's all Greek to me. In these next 2 episodes, we're going to look at why there seems to be so much ancient Greek and Roman stuff in Western civilization. And it's going to be an adventure that's going to take us across Europe and across time, like some way more historically accurate Doctor Who episode. So in this first part, we're going to look at what ideas and things we actually got from the classical world. And in part 2 over here, we're going to look at the classical world's comeback tour, as well as get some of my thoughts. But before we get into that, let's clear up a bit of the terminology here. So the term classic or classical generally refers to more or less 500 BCE to 500 CE in Greece, Rome, and the Mediterranean, or roughly the period starting with the advent of democracy in Athens to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The more official terminology for this chunk of history is just classical antiquity, but for the sake of simplicity, assume if I'm talking classic anything, this time period and place is what I'm referring to. The classical world then generally refers to the area inhabited and influenced by Greece and Rome from this era, and the classics generally refers to the recorded writings and artwork and history and philosophy of this period. Also, this whole question is predicated on the understanding/existence of Western civilization, and that term generally refers to the overarching culture, language, religion, ideologies, and politics of Europe and the countries that are its direct descendants, like the United States or Australia. Obviously, these places are not all one homogeneous, unified thing. There are countless differences in culture and language and ideologies between, say, Russia and Canada and Portugal, but there are enough similar themes and characteristics that I feel it reasonable to roll with this generalization. However, keep in mind that both of these terms are quite broad, fairly ambiguous, and with a lot of debatable characteristics. For example, I noted earlier that the end of the classical period is generally seen as the fall of the Western Roman Empire around 500 CE. However, that right there is fairly problematic. The Western Roman Empire had been losing authority and control over its territories for decades before the widely accepted fall date of 476 CE, and multiple barbarian invasions combined with a couple sackings of Rome itself meant Roman authority was a shadow of its former self long before 476 CE. Many historians now view the Roman Empire's collapse as more of a slow transformation than a big kaboom anyway, so the use of this date is even more problematic, not to mention the fact that the Eastern Roman Empire continued for 1,000 more years after the end of the classical period. This ambiguity applies to the term Western civilization as well. I think most people would agree that Spain is certainly part of Western civilization, but what about somewhere like Mexico, which has heavy Spanish elements but retains a lot of the culture and traditions and ideologies of lots of notably not European peoples? Whew, that was actually quite a tangent. Hey! Now that we've got that terminological nonsense out of the way, let's return to our
randomly relevant random word
for this episode, legacy. Legacy in a historical context is the imprint one's culture or history or people leave behind on the people who come after them. And really all cultures and languages and peoples are a result of the legacies of the people who came before them. Really? Two hair jokes in 2 minutes? Really? That said, I picked legacy for this episode because a lot of the grand historical importance, if you will, of the classical world is not just from its accomplishments and events, but because of the large and long-lasting impact it had on the rest of Western civilization. While I'd argue really anything of significance done by anyone in history has had some noteworthy impact on the present day, the classical period really set the foundations for a lot of the things that define Western civilization. Not only did this period leave a long-standing legacy on the Europeans that followed it, but perhaps more importantly, Europeans continued to harken back to that legacy and that time period as a way of defining themselves. From the Roman conquest of Sparta in 146 BCE to the silly 300 movies, roughly 1900 years later, Westerners love to draw parallels between the classical world and their own, and see the classical people as an inspiration for their own time period. I mean, when I say the word Greece to a Westerner who lives outside of Greece, I think it's telling they're probably thinking either this or this, and probably not this or this. To sum up, there are plenty of actual ideas and history that we've adopted from the classical world, but a lot of the influence is also because we find them influential, and we'll be hitting both of these ideas throughout the episode set. Part 1, Greeks and Romans and columns, oh my. Let's start with the classical Greeks. So the classical period in Greek history generally starts with the overthrowing of the last Athenian dictator in 510 BCE and ends with Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE. That means, relatively speaking, we're looking at a pretty short time frame for something that has defined much of Western civilization. So perhaps one of the biggest and most commonly recognized places in the classical world was the city-state of Athens on the western Aegean Sea. While not every single important Greek figure of this period actually came from Athens, the city-state's unique circumstances allowed the sciences and arts to blossom. The philosophy of Plato and Socrates set the foundation for modern philosophy and rational thought, to the point where British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once famously claimed that all of European philosophy was simply, quote, a series of footnotes to Plato. Athens set the stage for theater. Set the stage? Get it? No? In the Western world, laying the foundations for the formal tragedy and comedy, and Greek-esque amphitheaters are still mimicked to this day. Lyrical poetry, philosophical dialogues, and literary critique, among others, are writing styles that developed in classical Greece. The school of history itself is also rooted in this period, with the father of history, Herodotus, who you heard about all in the preface, and the notably more accurate uncle of history, Thucydides' documentation of the Peloponnesian Wars. Classical Greeks like Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Euclid were some of the first Western scientists, focusing on observing and explaining how the natural world worked, and many of their systems and ideas in the fields of medicine, biology, and math are still relevant to this day, and this is why many common scientific terms are rooted in Greek. Heck, the Greek world is responsible for much of the written language used in the Western world today, as they added vowels to the alphabet and even gave us the word alphabet. Athens is widely remembered for its culture and philosophy and scientific thinking, all of which clearly bleed into the modern world, but arguably its most unique quality was its political system, democracy. While Athenian democracy is a pretty far cry from modern-day democracies, the idea of turning power over to the common people instead of a king or oligarchy was pretty revolutionary and fairly unheard of for its time, and the people of Athens were certainly aware of this. To be clear, Athens from 500 to 300 BCE was not the sole source of Greek awesomeness, but the vast amount of Athenian written texts from this period that survived the ages means it's hard not to play favorites. We'll touch more on this idea in part 2, as while Athens tended to represent the heights of human culture and society, the city-state of Sparta was often remembered for its martial prowess and warlike efficiency. So, speaking of loving Sparta, written records, and being influential to the modern day, let's talk about the Romans. If you remember our original dates for the classical period, you'll note that while it starts with the Greeks, it ends with the Romans, and the Roman Empire/Republic certainly left its mark on Western civilization. Before we get into the things the Romans gave us, let's talk about the history here. Keep in mind that while the Greek influences we talked about come from a relatively short period of time and a small chunk of the Mediterranean, the Roman Republic/Empire lasted many centuries and covered an area from Spain to Syria and from Scotland to the Sudan. The Romans were a militaristic and warlike people, and a lot of their legacy comes from the Romanization or Latinization of the areas they conquered, meaning they often left a tangible physical imprint on the people they encountered. Well, and lots of those too. So what did those Romans do to influence modern Western society? Well, a lot. Let's start with language. The Romans made Latin the lingua franca of huge swaths of Europe, and 5 major European languages are rooted in Latin, with languages like English and German borrowing tons of words from Latin. Latin was so thoroughly ingrained in European affairs that Latin would remain the lingua franca for over 1,000 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire. On top of this, the Romans gave us the Latin script, which is the script used to write this script and the most widely used script in the world, and certainly the most widely used in the Western world. The Romans also left a large legacy in the ways of building and statecraft. The Romans were excellent urban planners, and many older cities in Europe are built around the classical Roman grid style. The Romans built remarkably effective aqueducts and sewer systems, built over 80,000 kilometers of roads that connected people across Europe, and built massive public works programs that would continue to both inspire and exist to the present day. The civil law system used by most of continental Europe is fundamentally based out of the Roman legal code, and the common law system used in the English-speaking world is heavily influenced by the Roman code as well. However, two of the biggest things that the Western world took from the Romans weren't really things the Romans invented at all. The first is a preservation of Greek texts and ideas, as the Romans were an extremely adaptable people, and they, like the Europeans that followed them, were fascinated by Greek culture. The Romans borrowed and adapted tons of ideas from their Greek forebears. Many Roman gods are simply Greek gods with different names. The Latin script we talked about earlier was a Roman modification of the Greek alphabet, and a lot of Roman art, writing, and culture was heavily influenced by the Greeks. Not only did the Romans preserve and adapt this knowledge, they spread it throughout their empire, furthering the Greek legacy on Western culture. The other big thing that the Romans gave us that they actually didn't invent was arguably one of the biggest forces ever to grace world history, Christianity. While the Roman state originally wasn't a big fan of the religion, Christianity was able to spread throughout Europe across the Roman roads and flourished under the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The empire officially adopted Christianity with Emperor Justinian in 380 CE, creating the foundation of the Catholic Church and ensuring that this would be a fundamental element in Western society. While I've just laid out a handful of the actual ideas we've taken from the classical world, as I mentioned before, Europeans and Westerners continued to look back to this period as a way of defining themselves, and classical influence would continue to rear its head in less tangible, but certainly not less important ways again and again in the centuries to come. Also, there was this Renaissance thing, and that helped too. But more about that in part 2. Thank you very much for watching. You can find part 2 right over here. I appreciate your time. I am Professor Jordan, and I will see you all next class. From the Roman conquest of Sparta in 476 BC. Wow. Just really throwing, actually that would have been the Roman Empire's fall date. I just completely ignored the number that was actually written. I was like, oh, Roman something, 476, got it. Oh my god.